So kidcore, let's talk about that. If you were to put kidcore into Tumblr or Twitter, you'd find lots of pastel colors and cute things. Currently on Twitter, it is teeming with Animal Crossing people talking about the aesthetic and decorating their islands. But we'll get more into them in a little bit. On Tumblr specifically, you'll find lots of, again, aesthetic photos of stuffed animals and colorful trinkets. You'll find art in a cartoony style and with, again, lots of pastel colors. This whole style, however, didn't start online. In fact, it has a long history that has more than just ruffles and hearts. I'm sure many of you have heard of the term Kawaii. Its direct translation covers everything from blushing to innocence, cuteness, and more. But most agree upon Kawaii meaning cute, and that's how most people use it. The sort of Kawaii being used as a style, or as what we would now like to call an aesthetic, started in Japan in the 1960s and 70s. During this time, Japan was going through mass student uprisings, and while this could fill up a whole video of its own, and I implore you to do your own research about the student uprisings in Japan of 1960s and 70s, it is super interesting, and I put an article down below that I thought really covered it and was like pretty short considering this was a major event in the time. But what is relevant to the uprisings to us is that many people were unhappy with how society was treating students, with how it was treating minorities, and this caused a popularity in people embracing counterculture in order to kind of break away from these traditionalism ideals. So these include the ones that I'm sure everyone has seen and heard about: rock and roll, punk, but in Japan there was also the rise of Kawaii as a counterculture movement. And this is where we start to see Kawaii as we see it today. At the start, Kawaii was taken on by mostly women and girls, and it was a way for them to break away from the boxes that society was trying to push them into. Rather than the traditionalism ideals of womanhood such as purity, honesty, and beauty, instead these women found a way to be more independent and break away from elders and the family as well as society's expectations for them. And this was the start of Kawaii fashion. And something unique to the Kawaii fashion and Kawaii movement, so to say, was that unlike with counterculture such as rock and roll, Kawaii wasn't focused on any forms of sex, drugs, alcohol, or violence. And in fact, it instead embraced innocence and cuteness and wasn't revolved around those things. So it was breaking away from that and traditionalism. The Kawaii movement and this stage directly related to the student uprisings continued through the late 1970s. Where we then see another notable addition to the Kawaii culture, and this was round writing. This is where girls would write horizontally rather than the vertically writing that is traditional for Japanese, and they would also round out their characters. So rather than having like more straight lines, they would round them out. They would go as far as to add hearts and animals and different cute drawings along with their writing. It again showed the younger generation of girls, mostly, pretty much exclusively, straying away from traditionalism and trying to break their own thing. So even this little form of writing was a form of rebellion. And in fact, the form of writing had to be outright banned in many schools. Now, one company that was involved very much so in the growth of Kawaii and had a part in its growth and its history is Sanrio, I believe, or Sanrio. Sorry, my second language, although it's not bilingual, is Spanish, so if I say any foreign words, it's going to sound like Spanish, but I'm going to say Sanrio, and I'm going to put it up on the screen somewhere. But they had the character Hello Kitty. From the beginning, this was an icon with both the products and character appearing everywhere, all over Kawaii culture. Everyone was eating it up. This is also where you see Kawaii going further away from a niche and more into mainstream of both street fashion, but also just kind of the mainstream consciousness. In the 1980s, you see Kawaii fashion and aesthetics becoming more broadly available and more broadly enjoyed. However, this is also where we get into the first dark history of Kawaii culture. In the 1980s is where you started seeing an amount of fetishization of the kawaii fashion. However, I think something notable is that this wasn't done by the people wearing and participating in the kawaii culture fashion, because they were just trying to stray away from traditionalism. They weren't trying to take sex and make it part of their thing, but instead it came from outsiders, mostly. In what I read, they said men. The way that men interacted with kawaii was through fetish rather than wearing the clothing and participating in the message. And while this was the minority of the culture, this is where we start to see that happen. Then as we enter into the 2000s is where we see two things. We see this culture starting to spread more so into the West, although it had been for some time, mostly in the use of advertising. This is where we see it spread to the West, and we also see more men involved in kawaii fashion as participants and not purely in a sexual way as was done in the past. As the 2010s roll around in the West, we see an amount of mainstream attention to kawaii, and a sub-part of this is Lolita fashion, but it's very closely related to kawaii. And that's where I, a Gen Zer, first saw an introduction of this with Melanie Martinez. We also see things like Jeremy Scott, a 2015 fall collection on runways. So we were even seeing a kind of kawaii fashion on runway scenes. And another notable thing is that I think that this 2015 collection looks less like kawaii fashion, which mostly has to do with ruffles and big frilly things, and I think more closely relates to kidcore as we see it now, with 90s icons on it, and it being semi-modern clothing, yet with this childlike element added to it. So I think that's something. I think it shows kind of where the distinction between kawaii and kidcore is found. Kawaii was still remaining highly popular in Japanese street fashion, and while fashion and aesthetic culture grows online, kawaii finds a place in this. You can see as the internet grew, there's so many kawaii icons on YouTube, on Pinterest. I'm sure there's so many Pinterest boards, Tumblr, Twitter even. There's all of these kawaii people on there online. So this is where I'm going to start switching away from the kawaii side to calling things kidcore, because again, like I said, I think there is a difference. I think there are different communities who are purely taking place of kawaii fashion because they focus on fashion, and kidcore seems to be more focused on the aesthetic, photos, to an amount fashion, art, and now like Animal Crossing islands and those kinds of things, which Animal Crossing is basically people's like aesthetic. It's like a representation of their aesthetics. And so now with the kidcore, well, we do see some of this kawaii mentality staying, of breaking away from traditionalism. What I've seen as well is people using kidcore as a way to reclaim their childhood. Whether because of trauma or being forced to grow up too fast or whatever reason, they lost parts of their childhood that they should have, or they felt they should have gotten. They're using kidcore as a way to reclaim these things that were taken away from them and re-embrace that. And it's still meant to be as a fashion thing or an aesthetic thing, and people aren't doing it as a thing. And many times they're in fact embracing the style to get away from hypersexualization. And I mean, we've seen it similar. Obviously, Billie Eilish isn't part of kidcore, but Billie Eilish talks about how she dresses the way she dresses in order to try and get people to not sexualize her as much as they would if she dressed in other manners. And while that's not something that people should have to do, it's something that people do. And kidcore is, for some people, a way to do that, a way to get away from the hypersexualization and is in fact the opposite of what some people are trying to claim of them sexualizing kid stuff, but in fact trying to take kid stuff in order to take away sexualization. Now, the current controversy around kidcore is around the Animal Crossing community. It's people on Animal Crossing Twitter specifically who are claiming these different things about kidcore. It's something new to them and not something that's been happening on Tumblr or on these other places or on kidcore outside of the Animal Crossing community, as far as I can tell, although there is history of people having negative thoughts like these towards kidcore, Lolita fashion, Kawaii fashion in the past, so it's not unfounded for things to happen, but I'm specifically going to be talking about how it's happening in the Animal Crossing community. So these islands that are happening in the Animal Crossing community are very much so pastel colors, stuffed animals, and cute designs, cute custom designs. But people are claiming that kidcore is pedophilic in nature, and that these islands are sexualizing children. I'm taking the stance that it's not, especially when you look at it in the case of Animal Crossing islands. It's not. That has never been the purpose of this style, as we just went through the history of it, and from the execution I think that also tells you something about the way that this is meant to be taken and the way that people are using this. And this culture isn't filled with nudes and explicit actions and explicit images, but only the cute items and the fashion, and I think that's what separates this group from more pornographic places that will exist, but they will take these similar things, but then they will add that layer of sexual situations into it, and I think that's what separates them, is that, well, yes, these things can be taken and put into a sexual context. That isn't the purpose of these. These aren't meant to be that. They are meant to be only the aesthetic, and there is a distinct separation between these two groups based off of the other things happening in them. I hope that makes sense. And if anything, the intention of these spaces is the same as Kawaii. It is a message of independence, of coming away from traditionalism, and of reclaiming people's identity. And again, they are not being associated with these pornographic places. And I think that this is just people trying to express themselves again, and it's the same way that people like cottagecore and urbancore and all these other aesthetics, people like kidcore, people like pastel colors, and they like stuffed animals, and it doesn't, just because it involves children doesn't mean it's inherently wrong, and especially because they're not sexualizing them. An argument you will hear from people who are part of the kidcore community on Twitter is that the people who are inherently associating child things and kids things with sex are the problem, because they are projecting sexualization onto these childish things when there isn't inherently anything sexual about stuffed animals and pastel colors or what the kidcore community has been producing. And this is where, like all things in life, things get complicated. Something that I saw from one person on Twitter, so I don't know how widespread of a thing this is, but this is something notable that exists, is that because of their own trauma, they associate kidcore with things that make them uncomfortable or are triggering for them. Now, with this specific person, they also said that this was their own personal thing, and from what I gathered, they weren't going to support or participate in the kidcore community, but they weren't actively sowing discourse beyond explaining why they were uncomfortable with it, mostly to their followers, I think, as like a, hey, I'm not going to be associated or doing anything with this community, here's why, and just talking with a few kidcore people. Because of this, I did, if there's any screenshots up, I will blank out their name, because I don't think they want to be talking about this too much actively, but that is something that is out there, and I think that is valid, and it's almost the opposite side of people who are taking their trauma and they find kidcore something that helps them, and is empowering to them, whereas on this side it's kind of something that, because of their trauma, is disempowering and makes them uncomfortable. And so obviously it's your trauma, that's valid, and that's okay, but they seem to understand that this isn't on fault of the kidcore community, and they don't seem to be actively against it. And then the other side of the boat is that people think that kidcore reminds them of CP stuff, and it therefore makes them uncomfortable. And this is where I think people need to be more educated and also like think about these things critically. The purpose of this, as I've said a million times and will say a million more, is it is a counterculture style. It is the kidcore and kawaii stuff is not meant to be anywhere associated with that. It is meant to be a form of independence and all those different things I've said a million times. And just because people have taken this style and this culture and sexualized it, doesn't mean that those that aren't related to that sexualization shouldn't be allowed to enjoy a style that means something to them. They didn't cause the harm, they should be allowed to enjoy their style, is my view on things. And I do think that if after learning about what kidcore is actually about, you still can't separate this lens of sexualization from something childish or something that is meant to be based off of traditional child things, then I do think you need to look at what society has taught you. Because nothing about these images is inherently sexual. And nothing about this style is sexual. In fact, it's oftentimes meant to stray away from that. And some people just like pastel colors and cute things, just the same way that some people's favorite color is orange, or some people like urban core. And nowadays, you can find grossly age-inappropriate items for children. And I think this does show a shift in attitudes that society has taken, that I think is gross, and I think society needs to stop, which is society trying to put sexual ideals onto children. And if anything, I hope that kidcore can help stop that from happening. Because a lot of it is media trying to always sexualize us and always use it as advertising and trying to push these products and stuff. And kidcore, at the end of the day, is meant to be a counterculture. And I hope that by taking these things and taking these things for themselves and making it something different and making childish things be childish and holding on to innocence and childlike wonder, I hope that maybe kidcore will even have a place to stop that and to help us stray away from that and help us look at society and not let that happen. But maybe that's me being idealistic. But at the end of the day, kidcore is an aesthetic. It is pastel colors and stuffed animals. There is nothing inherently sexual. There's nothing inherently wrong with liking these things. And I think, unless people have better arguments than the ones that I've seen, but these are the ones I covered are all that I've seen. And I'll make another video if it turns out there's some major scandal or something. I think people need to just let people be and let people enjoy the style. Okay, that's all for today. So if you guys have any comments, insights, problems with the video, please, my Twitter is linked down below. You can DM me, you can tweet me, we can have a conversation. You can go down in the comments down below. I will be welcome to, again, have a conversation about this. My sources are also linked in the description down below. So if there's any problems with any of my sources and it turns out I was totally wrong about something, again, you can check me on that and I will put out a retraction if need be. I'm not against that. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It is what it is. So if you like these more commentary style videos, please also tell me about that. Leave a like down below. It was kind of fun. I had a lot of fun. We're doing crisscross applesauce now because my hips kind of hurt from being sideways for like 30 minutes. But it was kind of fun doing research about this topic and learning about the Japan 1960s student uprisings, which is something I never would have learned about otherwise. So that was super fun. So I might do more of these. I think I'm still going to stick to mostly my typical style of video, but I might throw in a few commentary videos in there to kind of mix things up, have some fun, but mostly only if there's a topic that really interests me, because this kind of like, it interested me, and then I started doing research and it really interested me, so, you know. But go ahead and subscribe if you enjoy me. I do Minecraft, Animal Crossing, Overcooked, art, now commentary. I'm sure there will be something that tickles your fancy, so go ahead and subscribe. I hope everyone has a wonderful tea time midnight snack, second breakfast, depending on where you are. And I hope I will see you all. I will see you all in the next video. Bye bye.